Let's Ban Applause by Glenn Gould. The good citizens of Toronto, my hometown, received last spring their annual visit from the Metropolitan Opera Company. This is an occasion much looked forward to by all of us, and this season was the subject of special attention, since it involved the transfer of that splendid ensemble from the regal expanse of a hockey arena to the more confined proscenium of a new theater constructed in our behalf through the generosity, civic vision, and tax advantage of a local brewing firm. The Metropolitan, with its accustomed tact and diplomacy, wisely declined to present to us the alcoholic dissipations of Sir John Falstaff or the aphrodisiac delusions of Master Tristan, or indeed any other tableaus which might compromise the corporate image of its host. But, despite these courtesies, the visit was attended by a most disagreeable correspondence in the local press. This emanated from the displeasure which several writers voiced with the relatively restricted capacity of the new salon, and from sympathy with those of our less affluent fellow citizens who found the consequent raise in admission prohibitive. It was not these modest though justified complaints that arrested my attention, however, but the grave alarms raised by several of our more worldly wise columnists, those who have attended concerts as far afield as Buffalo, that what we had lost with the reduced attendance at the Metropolitan was not money, a concept which all Torontoans could readily grasp, but was, rather, that intangible spirit of theatrical excitement generated by those whose native customs permit the unabashed display of enthusiasm or displeasure. We had, we were told, callously excluded the services of that indispensable component of grand opera, the upper balcony jeer leader. This view, disseminated in the local press, caused much consternation among my fellow citizens, an effect it surely would not have achieved in any other city. This is, of course, because Toronto is one of the last bastions of Puritan influence in North America, and, despite the encroachment of science, Henry Miller, and immigration, we have managed to hold firm those convictions upon which the faith of our fathers was founded. We do not regard the theater as an intrinsically wicked institution. We do consider it in need of careful and constant scrutiny. But once we have satisfied ourselves as to the moral discernment of its productions, we proceed to it with a total humility born of reverence for that which we do not wholly understand. It would never have occurred to us to demand for ourselves the right to proclaim our approbation demonstratively by rudely punctuating a work of musical theater. Even less would we presume, by forwarding uncomplimentary noises from the stalls, to express our distaste for the message of a composer whom we found difficult or the hapless screechings of an ill-advised soprano. This is not to say that we would withhold a measure of encouragement from an artist whose work and whose private life are beyond reproach. I have seen elderly ladies remove their gloves to render their tribute to the symphonies of Mr. Elgar. After all, he was well received at court, wasn't he? And certainly our pleasure with Dr. Mendelssohn knows no bounds. And I can attest from personal experience that Torontoans are well able to convey their consternation at the beeps and groans of Mr. Anton Webern by a silence as timeless as those within that gentleman's music itself. By now, we were being told by this racy contingent of high-living newspapermen that we must surrender our right to the genteel response of our cultural tradition and look for leadership to those whose heritage does not consider musical theater an adjunct of the church, as ours does, but rather as a comfortably upholstered extension of the Roman Colosseum. This has given me occasion to ponder the relationship of applause to musical culture, and I have come to the conclusion, most seriously, that the most efficacious step which could be taken in our culture today would be the gradual but total elimination of audience response. I am disposed toward this view because I believe that the justification of art is the internal combustion it ignites in the hearts of men, and not its shallow, externalized public manifestations. The purpose of art is not the release of a momentary ejection of adrenaline, but is, rather, the gradual, lifelong construction of a state of wonder and serenity. Through the ministrations of radio and the phonograph, we are rapidly and quite properly learning to appreciate the elements of aesthetic narcissism, and I use that word in its best sense, and are awakening to the challenge that each man contemplatively create his own divinity. The effect of this newly acquired introspection has been salutary upon our culture as a whole. Never before have Ockeghem and Costly invaded our drawing-room in the company of Chopin and Liszt. Never before has Gesualdo competed with Schubert for our attention. Never before has a composer been able to render electronically the exact specifications of his intention without resorting to the self-centered affectations of a performing middleman. If, then, it has been possible to achieve within one generation this degree of conditioned listening, Surely the next generation will find it no mighty task to carry this quality of introspection one step further, into the concert hall and theater themselves. There are those, of course, who counsel that only in the theater, only with the direct communion of artist to listener, can we experience the high drama of human communication. The answer to this, it seems to me, is that art in its loftiest mission is scarcely human at all. But surely, some may counter, applauding after a performance is as natural to a listener as sneezing at the sun on a windy day. I reply that one may listen to a recording of a Beethoven symphony alone or in the company of friends and, though deeply moved at its conclusion, experience no more urgent need than a quick trip to the icebox for a soda water. And if we concede, then, that it is the law of the herd that governs the response of an audience to a performer, can this response be further justified? Democracy, the rule of majority, someone argues. Why should the paying customer be deprived of his right to voice his opinion? Well, apart from the fact that the other paying customers did not subscribe to hear his opinion, one must take into account the peculiar laws of acoustical psychology, whereby a strategically placed rooter or detractor may, by applying the proper vocal leverage at a judicious moment, enlist the bellowing echo of many hundreds of his fellows. But what harmful effect can it have, someone asks. Everybody knows that artists are incredibly conceited and quite able to survive the taunts of an impolite laity. Ah, are they indeed, I ask? Or are the absurdly competitive extravaganzas of our operatic colleagues not the product of, or maybe the antidote to, the vulgar artistic hostility of those sun-baked societies who have built an operatic tradition in which their primal instinct for gladiatorial combat has found a more gracious but thinly disguised sublimation? All right, our disputant allows. Granted that a few of the less sturdy vocalists must concede in the fray, but what about the composers? Let's not forget that many of our great composers became famous by having more disorderly premieres than their colleagues were able to muster. Let's not forget Stravinsky and the riots at the Right, or Schoenberg and the pummelings at Pierrot. True, I retort, they did become famous, and they deserved to become famous, but not because of the riots, and not even, I would venture to suggest, because of those particular works. A more just citation, if you will allow me, would be an incident at one of our own Toronto premieres, an incident which deeply shocked all true Torontoans. It happened several years ago, at the first performance of a new concerto by a Canadian composer, a lady of considerable gift, though perhaps of less resilient spirit than a Stravinsky or a Schoenberg. Preceding the performance, an introductory speaker, non-Torontoan, spoke harshly to us on the subject of apathy toward contemporary composition. He urged us, as only a non-Torontoan would, to express our approval of the works we enjoyed, or, if we were so inclined, our disapproval. Now, this adjuration would certainly have gone for naught but for the unlucky chance that in the audience that night there sat another non-Torontoan, a historian by profession and an intelligent chap, but a fellow whose musical sympathies stopped somewhere short of Joaquin Desprez. Well, as you can imagine, the new concerto did not fall upon receptive ears, and so our friend the historian, having been encouraged to voice his estimation, did so. Regrettably, he was being closely scrutinized at the time by some eager members of his graduate class, non-Torontoans all, who were seated nearby, and so hoot, said the professor, and hoot, hoot, said the students, while visions of better grades danced in their heads. I wish I could relate that the concerto and its composer became infamous that night, but such was not to be the case, and it has not been rendered since. There is, however, a sequel to the story. The lady composer had another premiere in Toronto quite recently, a new symphony. Our historian was not present, but nonetheless the new work was shown the same intolerance as its elder brother, the only work in our concert season to be so honored. Clearly, the herd is breeding. Aha, says the disputant, in a final effort to demolish my case. This fellow Gould speaks with a singular passion. Perhaps he, too, has been put to his heels to escape the wrath of an outraged public. Yes, I admit candidly there was such an occasion. It was in Florence, or as we international men prefer to say, Firenze. I had just concluded a performance of the Schoenberg Suite, Opus 25, which, although it was at the time 35 years old, had not yet been admitted to the vocabulary of the Florentines. I arose from the instrument to be greeted by a most disagreeable chant from the upper balcony, which was at once contradicted by feverish encouragements from the lower levels. Although I was new to this experience, I instinctively realized that no harm could come to me so long as I permitted the spectators to vent their fury upon each other. Therefore, I cunningly milked the applause for 6 curtain calls, an exceptional acclaim for Opus 25, and thereafter the exhausted audience fell back in a liverish somnolence to attend the Goldberg variations. I feel that I have now presented my case with true candor, and so it only remains to suggest ways and means to implement my proposal that the audience of the future should be seen but not heard. To this end, and for the assistance of any concert manager who may care to make use of it, I have drawn up the Gould plan for the abolition of applause and demonstrations of all kinds, hereinafter referred to as GPDAC. Needless to say, GPDAC, in its early stages will require, in addition to an active promotional campaign, a measure of goodwill on the part of artist, audience, and management alike. The first step in instituting GPDAC will be the scheduling of applauseless concerts on each Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. These 3 days, with their inherent liturgical connotations, are best able to evoke a suitably reverent state of mind. Concerts during the balance of the week, Monday through Thursday, could be billed as family excursion events, if I may beg a term from the airlines. Reduced prices would apply, and, of course, applause would be permitted. Children would be encouraged to attend during the week, and the duty to guide them there would provide a convenient excuse for those of the older generation who found the conversion difficult. The performers, naturally, would be strictly second team. At the prestige weekend concerts, the most serious problem in the early stage of GPDAC would be the selection of appropriate repertoire, works which will most contribute to the overall solemnity. I would suggest that large-scale oratorios be tried first, followed, perhaps, by a series consisting of music composed by members of royal houses. There is a wide field here, and works such as the Piano Concerto in A by Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, or the Pastoral Cantata for Lady Augusta's Birthday by Frederick Louis, Prince of Wales, and father, incidentally, of George III, deserve a firm place in our musical life. There might, of course, be certain judicious exclusions. Perhaps a composition by the Maharaja of Porbandar would not be appropriate for a Sunday concert in Karachi. The next area of repertoire to be included in GPDAC should be the presentation of Ninth Symphonies. Anybody's Ninth Symphony, really, although Shostakovich's might be a little flip. But after exploring the Beethoven-Bruckner-Mahler parallel, it would be wise to conclude with Schubert's Ninth, since, being really his 7th, it would introduce an appropriate note of secularism into the numerical piety of the series. I think that these few suggestions already indicate that the concert managers of the future will be under pressure to display an unaccustomed initiative in programming. Indeed, under the aegis of GPDAC, many of these gentlemen may well advance from their present status as bookers and become worthy of the old and noble title of impresario. In the early stages of GPDAC, the performers may feel a moment of unaccustomed tension at the conclusion of their selection, when they must withdraw to the wings unescorted by the homage of their auditors. For orchestral players, this should provide no hazard. A platoon of cellists smartly goose-stepping off stage is an inspiring sight. For the solo pianist, however, I would suggest a sort of lazy Susan device which would transport him and his instrument to the wings without his having to rise. This would encourage performance of those sonatas which end on a note of serene reminiscence, and in which the lazy Susan could be set gently in motion some moments before the conclusion. I foresee a heavy run on Opus 109, which could almost be staged provided there were a clear understanding between the soloist and the commissionaire backstage. As the founder and chronicler of GPDAC, I feel that it behooves me to be among the first to put it into practice. Needless to say, I have given this responsibility much consideration. Regrettably, Toronto does not provide the ideal site, since apart from the fact that it needs GPDAC less urgently than almost any other center, I personally would be confronted with the age-old civic antagonism for the local boy with a vision. It has occurred to me, as a co-director of the Stratford Music Festival, that the unique intimacy of our beautiful stage there might be especially appropriate for applauseless concerts, but then, those actors are such a wild, unpredictable bunch. Perhaps my chance will come at Mr. Tom Patterson's recently announced Dawson City Festival of 1962. Here, indeed, is virgin territory. Here is an audience without prejudice, without preconception. I wonder how Diamond Lil would react to the Maharaja of Porbandar.